The Hebrew Bible describes a long period of time during which the Israelites settled in ancient Egypt and who were enslaved and were ultimately liberated by Moses, who led them out of Egypt to Canaan. This is the foundational history of Israel, and it is known as the Exodus, or mass departure of the nation of Israel from Egypt. This is one of the greatest events in history of either Eastern or Western civilization. The transatlantic slave trade involved the transportation by slave traders of enslaved African people to the Americas. When those people began to write down their history in North America, they identified themselves and the indigenous Indian people of the Americas as the 12 tribes of Israel, who were slaves in ancient Egypt and who were freed from slavery by the Moses of the Christian Bible. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. From the New Testament, the book of John, chapter 8, verse 32. Moses was born a Hebrew Israelite from the tribe of Levi. Exodus chapter 2, verse 1 through 3. He spent 40 years in the house of Pharaoh. The book of Acts chapter 7, verse 23. And from the time he was an infant, passed as the Pharaoh's grandson. The book of Exodus chapter 2, verse 6 and verse 10. Robert Benjamin Lewis, 1802 to 1858. The Hebrew slaves of Egypt and Prince Hall Freemasonry, and the transatlantic slaves and Indians of the Americas. This is the history of what the most prominent Black and Native American men of the early United States of America published and wrote about their own Israelite biblical origin and their global history as the Israelites of the diaspora, when they were scattered from their homeland of Israel into Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Americas as Jews and Israelites since the times of the Assyrian and Roman empires. Universal Center for Renovation presents Historical and Biblical Israelites. This is strictly for educational purposes and commentary. This video is of biblical and secular historical literature. So enjoy. Joel Augustus Rogers, the author of the book Sex and Race, 3 volumes, and Nature Knows No Color Line. J. Rogers' Sex and Race, in 3 volumes, and Nature Knows No Color Line, was an extraordinary task of documenting in clear and brief language the contributions in global history of people who he believed to have a certain bloodline. He spoke about nations, groups, and some of the most famous people in history who appear to have a particular bloodline. If you have knowledge of past authors who made similar claims, but included in their writings the name Israel and their classification of this particular bloodline, then his work becomes a really interesting read. Instead of random persons or groups with a distinct lineage, it would rather be a guide into understanding the biblical Israelites after they were scattered out of the land of Israel, or rather, how the diaspora Jews mingled and mixed with every nation under the sun, but still left their own distinct mark on history. His series of books were first published in the 1940s, but there were other books published in the 1830s that made similar claims about the history of Black Americans and Native Americans and calling them Israelites and mentioning their contributions globally in history, living as ancient Romans and ancient Greeks and in living in other cultures. I believe this information had an effect on the Black American elites, such as the Prince Hall Masons, the Black Christian Church, the Black Jews and the Black Muslims, the civil rights organizations, and other related organizations. This awareness of history seemed to have shaped the way they viewed themselves and their beliefs in social and economic equality as American citizens. William Saunders Crowdy, 1847 to 1908, is given credit as one of the first Black Hebrew Israelites when he established the Church of God and Saints in 1896. But 70 years earlier, this information of Black Americans and Native Americans being the actual lineal descendants of the children of Israel was known among the most prominent Black Americans of that time. They knew about the Black Romans, Black Greeks, and many things that J.A. Rogers wrote about. J.A. Rogers was the best historian that preserved the history circulating among the Black elites. The Black elites once had a network and a brotherhood that had branches in North America, Europe, Africa, and Latin America before 1776 and the founding of the United States of America. And J. Rogers, he wasn't an isolated case. He published what many secretly believed. But because of events like the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, history of Black Americans, natives, and Latinos and people of the Caribbean was suppressed. This is from AI Overview. This is open source information. According to available information, the oldest known history book written by an African American is considered to be Light and Truth, collected from the Bible and ancient and modern history, containing the universal history of the colored man and Indian race from the creation of the world to the present time. Published in 1836 by abolitionist Robert Benjamin Lewis. Key points about this book. The author was Robert Benjamin Lewis. The publication date is 1836. And the significance, this book is considered the first book on Black history written by a Black person. For more data on this subject matter, we can go to American Heritage and their site, 15 classic books about Black history from American Heritage. American heritage, trusted writing on history, travel, and American culture since 1949. 15 classic books about Black history, from the souls of Black folk to the new Jim Crow. These texts are essential for anyone trying to understand the Black experience in America. African Americans have experienced a cultural paradox or a contradiction. For many years into World War II, they were largely excluded from the official history of the United States. Not in the sense that they went unmentioned. After all, one can hardly conceive a history of the United States that does not deal with slavery, abolitionism, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. But it was certainly possible to talk about blacks largely as objects, not agents, as primitives, as an unfortunate population whose presence was largely an annoyance, a misfortune, or a tragedy. Blacks were usually presented as a people without a history in Africa, and they were presented as contributing nothing historically important to American life. Indeed, Western slavery had brought blacks into the loop of civilization, and so was something of a perverse gift. Blacks were usually presented as a people without a history in Africa, and they were presented as contributing nothing historically important to American life. In 1836, the abolitionist Robert Benjamin Lewis published what is credited with being the first Black history by a Black. Light and Truth, collected from the Bible and ancient and modern history, containing the universal history of the colored man and Indian race, from the creation of the world to the present time. There has always been a populist strain running through some Black historiography that largely consists of the idea that the redemption of the African American mind, as well as the political salvation of the African American, will come with a proper understanding of a history that has not only been denied by whites, but distorted and stolen. A variety of writers would fit in this school. J. Rogers, Nature Knows No Color Line and Sex and Race. George G. M. James, Stolen Legacy. Greek philosophy is stolen Egyptian philosophy. J. A. Rogers and George G. M. Jones, among many others, considered themselves to be the only true physical descendants of ancient Israel. From the book edited by Edith Bruder and Tudor Parfit, African Zion, Studies in Black Judaism. William Saunders Crowdy, born August 11th, 1847, and died August 4th, 1908, was an American soldier, preacher, entrepreneur, and pastor. He was also one of the earliest known Black Hebrew Israelites in the United States. He established the Church of God and Saints of Christ in the year 1896, after he claimed to have had visions telling him that blacks were descendants of the 12 lost tribes of Israel. William Saunders Crowdy is usually given the credit as either starting the first Hebrew Israelite congregation for Black Americans or inspiring this idea among Black Americans. This is the furthest thing from the truth. This knowledge was circulating among the most prominent Black American networks before William Saunders was born. This narrative is controlled by people who are critical of the idea that Blacks, Native Americans, and Latinos could be the children of the biblical Israelites. If you can control the narrative, you can control the story, the beginning, middle, and ending. The beginning will be formerly enslaved people who were just recently living on plantations, misinformed, and without formal education, mistakenly identifying themselves with the Hebrews of history because of the common shared experience of slavery. The Hebrews' bondage in ancient Egypt and the Black Americans with Southern plantation slavery in America. This story has a bad beginning. The story of a well-intentioned but badly informed former enslaved population searching for a lost identity and who ultimately misappropriate another group's identity. The middle of the story is this ideal movement has picked up steam and has collected a huge following who are well meaning but are sadly living in a collective delusion of false identity. I guess the ending of this false narrative is the mass letdown of people who finally wake up from this mass psychosis of mental disorder when they realize or finally realize that their leaders and false prophets were exploiting their natural instincts of wanting to belong to something bigger than themselves. After this illusion has been exposed, most members will either return into the arms of their former denomination of Christianity, paganism in the form of Egyptology, or the 1001 form of do-it-yourself religion or world views. Then things will return to business as usual, and all this talk about God, salvation, and the end of the world will just go away. And this is why it is vital for us to know and understand the truth so our minds can be set free from the manipulation of men and institutions that will weaponize history for the benefits of profits, for money, or to keep the status quo that disrupts human life and normal activities and only breeds degeneracy and creates hate and misunderstanding among people. And so, although William Saunders Crowdy told the truth about Black Americans and their biblical origins as Israelites or Jews, he didn't make this up. He is just one of many men who pass this history on to the future generations of Black Americans. To put this idea all on his hands would be misleading and ignorant. Either you don't understand this history or you are working against history for malicious reasons. And now, William Saunders Crowdy was born August the 11th, 1847, and he died August 4th in the year 1908. The man to his right was born in 1802 and died in February in the year 1858. He also knew he was an Israelite, and he wrote the first history book for Black American history by a Black American in the year 1836. 11 years before William Saunders Crowdy was born, there was already a book in publication and circulation about the Israelite origin of the blacks and Native Americans, and this will also include Latinos. The man to the right, his name is Robert Benjamin Lewis, and he was born in the year 1802 and died in February the year 1858. Robert Benjamin Lewis did not originate this idea either. He just brought it to the attention of the British or Anglo-American world and the United States. In a time when the Spanish and the Portuguese empires were the most dominant European powers in the Western Hemisphere, and the Roman Catholic Church was an institution that all people feared and respected, the history of all the people of the Western Hemisphere was documented and cataloged. In the Spanish and Portuguese languages, these blacks, natives, and Latinos, their old families that once lived under Spanish and Portuguese dominion, was trying to explain to their new rulers, the British and Anglo-Americans, who was here in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, and what was going on. Unfortunately, the British are not known for their humility, so they didn't care about the rambling of history from those they considered primitives. But the Black American historians held on to the history, but it was ignored by mainstream Americans. Robert Benjamin Lewis, American author. From Ancient and Sacred History by Robert Benjamin Lewis. Coloring Universal History. Robert Benjamin Lewis. Light and Truth. Born 1802, Gardiner, Maine. Died February 1858, Haiti. Robert Benjamin Lewis. Born 1802, died February 1858, was an African and Native American author, best known for writing Light and Truth. He also was an entrepreneur, successfully marketing hair oil and other commodities, and also held 3 United States patents. Aside from his writings, little is known about Lewis's life. He was born in 1802 in the portion of Pittston, Maine, that later became the city of Gardiner. He was probably the eldest son of Matthias Lewis and Lucy Stockbridge Lewis, who announced their intention to marry in Pittston on July 28, 1800. It is assumed that Matthias Lewis was either a Mohegan from southern Rhode Island or a Pequot from the area around New London and Montville, Connecticut. On October 26, 1806, a 27-year-old sailor named Matthias Lewis from Kennebec County, Maine, Maine was a part of Massachusetts until it was admitted to the Union in 1820, appeared at the United States Customs House in New London, Connecticut, and received a seaman's protection certificate or protection papers. The certificate number 3468 describes him as being 5 feet 6 inches tall with a colored complexion. Light and Truth. Collected from the Bible in Ancient and Modern History, containing the universal history of the colored and the Indian race, from the creation of the world to the present time, by R.B. Lewis, or Robert Benjamin Lewis. A Colored Man. This book was originally published in the year 1836, originally a 137-page book, but in the year 1843, an expanded edition or version of the book was published. Introduction from the book Light and Truth. We publish this volume of collections from the sacred and profane history with a determination that a correct knowledge of the colored and Indian people, ancient and modern, may be extended freely, unbiased by any prejudicial effects from descent or station. In this country, where the former are subjected to the deepest degradation, where every variety of persecution is measured out to this unfortunate race, it is highly expedient that light and truth should be promulgated in order that oppressors should not consider it an indispensable duty to trample upon the weak and defenseless. In a large portion of this country, men, women, and children belonging to this race are held as articles of merchandise by the whites. The iron heart of gain hath forgotten every sacred and social relation, while at its expense millions have perished on the cursed rack. The history of this class is well known in many states in this country, but in some countries a mighty contrast is visible. Colored men enjoying every inherent attainment, free from human interference. The Indians in this country are also an abused people. The lofty hills and the verdant plains and the beautiful valleys that the poor Indians only 3 centuries since could proudly call his own are now possessed by a foreign people. Here and there we see a wanderer. They have been driven from their homes to inhabit the wilderness west of the Rocky Mountains. In other countries, this class are more happily situated. The author of this compilation has been some years in gathering this information. He is a descendant of the two races he so ably vindicates. We, the undersigned, in consideration of the valuable information contained in this work, and in behalf of the welfare of the colored and Indian race, submit the same to a candid perusal or examination. The Publishing Committee: Thomas Dalton, Charles H. Roberts, Andres V. Lewis, James Scott. Boston, January 25th, 1844. This was a work of history, supported by some of the most prominent men of the day. This book was supported by prominent men like Thomas Dalton, born 1794, died 1883. Thomas Dalton, born October 17th, 1794, in Gloucester, Essex, Massachusetts, United States, son of His father was unknown and mother unknown. Siblings unknown. But he was the husband of Lucy Lou Dalton, and they were married May 13th, 1834, in Boston, Suffolk, Massachusetts, United States. And he died August 30th, 1883, at age 88, in Boston, Suffolk, Massachusetts, United States. And this book was supported by Thomas Dalton, and he was the fourth Grand Master of Prince Hall, Grand Lodge, Massachusetts. This is not an expose piece on the Prince Hall Freemasons. After all, the Prince Hall Freemasons is primarily a British or Anglo-American organization. They received their charter from the Grand Lodge of Ireland in 1784. Many Black American families that belonged to the Prince Hall Freemasons lived in the Americas before the British colonies. They belonged to older networks under Spanish and Portuguese rule. So they was just transferring their services officially to the newly created British and Anglo-American Empire when they became Prince Hall Freemasons. The older black networks before Prince Hall and before the British control over the United States of America spanned the Atlantic world with branches in Europe, Africa, North and South America. They were black Catholics and New Christians, which included Jews or black Sephardi's. In America, this took on a more Protestant structure after the English became the dominant force in the Western Hemisphere. Some preview pages from Robert Benjamin Lewis' book, Light and Truth. The subject matter is similar in format when compared with J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race, which was published in the 1940s, 104 years after the book Truth and Light was published. This is a preview from some of the pages from Robert Benjamin Lewis' book, Light and Truth. The subject matter is similar, and the format is similar when we compare this book with J.A. Rogers' book, Sex and Race. Sex and Race was published in the 1940s, but 104 years earlier, the book Light and Truth was first published. The book Light and Truth was the first book in America that was written by a Black American, and it was about the history of Black Americans. That's why this is a groundbreaking history. In chapter 5, Colored Generals and Soldiers, who's listed? Carthaginian generals, Hamilcar, Hannibal, and an important South American soldier, Henry Diaz. In chapter 8 contains history on the Grecian philosophers, the Roman philosophers. In chapter 11, the meaning of the word Negro, or the Moorish castle. History about Black Americans, Native Americans, before they were considered slaves in the Americas. The native or indigenous population of the Americas are documented in this book as Israelites in the year 1836, in the first history book in America written by an Black American. Arguments in favor of the Native Americans being the descendants of Israel. O Israel, Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations. The Lord shall assemble the outcast of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Woe unto them who have robbed me, and have enriched themselves in land, in blood, in the souls of men. These natives all appear to have had one origin. Their language appears to have been Hebrew. The Indians have had their Ark of the Covenant, have been in the practice of circumcision, and have acknowledged one and only one God. They have one tribe, answering in various respects to the tribe of Levi, and they have something answering to the Jewish cities of refuge. Indian pyramids resemble the high places of ancient Israel. Phylacteries, or ancient Hebrew writings, have been found on Indian Hill in Pittsfield. In this book, Light and Truth, written by Robert Benjamin Lewis, there's an index of books and authors to support the Native American Indian Israelite origin, and it is found in this book. Authors and authorities adduced to prove the tribes of Israel and America. According to these authors and scriptures of truth, the natives of America are the Israelites, the Jews, and as they are oppressed and driven from the land. When you place the book Light and Truth, published in 1836, side by side with the book Sex and Race, published in the 1940s, it is easy to come to the conclusion that the information in Sex and Race is updated, so a new generation can keep in touch with the complexity of their biblical origins. On the left is Light and Truth, 1836. Page 303 is History of the Grecian Philosophers. On the right, Sex and Race is a chapter, chapter 7, The Negro in Ancient Greece. Both of these books contain history of Black Americans, their history in ancient Greece. Also, in the book Light and Truth, it goes into the history of the Roman philosophers. And on the right, Sex and Race, chapter 8, Negroes in ancient Rome and Carthage. This book was written, or both of these books were written, so that we could remember our history in the Greek and Roman empires, and our history in North Africa and Moorish Spain. And so we could remember important historical characters in history. Remember, Hannibal was an Israelite. Chapter 5, Colored Generals and Soldiers. Hannibal. On the right, from sex and race, the yellow highlighted sentence. Hannibal, most famous of all Carthaginians, was a Negro. This would mean he was an Israelite. And this was something that the people who published the first history book written by a Black American wanted us to understand about who we were. In the 1940s, J. Rogers reiterated that same sentiment in his book. And also, Light and Truth and Sex and Race, both books were written so we would not forget our contributions in the Western Hemisphere. For the empires that existed on this side of the world before the British, the Spanish, and Portuguese, we can't expect that our services will be remembered. So we have to keep our own records. That was the sentiment of the writers in Light and Truth and in J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race. We served under the rulership of the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, and we did great services for them, militarily, economically, financially. These books are written so that would be remembered. So the first book on Black American history, or history of Black Americans, or Blacks of the Americas and the Native Americans, both records the history of Henry Diaz. In the chapter 5, Colored Generals and Soldiers in Light and Truth, Henry Diaz. Also, in Sex and Race, the history of Henry Diaz is recorded. So this is a quote from the book Sex and Race. In less than a century, the Negroes had become so numerous that they provided the balance of power whereby the Portuguese were able to defeat their Dutch neighbors who had swarmed into the country from the West Indies, Guyana, and Holland. Led by the renowned Henry Diaz, a full-blooded Black, the Negroes defeated Prince Maurice of Nassau and broke the power of the Dutch in Brazil, which in turn had its repercussions in New Netherland, now New York. In this war, some of the Blacks reached the rank of Captain Moore, a title formerly reserved for the upper class. So this book, or these two books, separated by 100 years, the sentiment of these books was, let us not forget our contributions in the Western Hemisphere for the empires that existed on this side of the world before the British. We can't expect that our services would be remembered. We have to keep our own records. This is just a preview. More to be continued in the next video about this subject matter. Israelites who knew they were Israelites in 1838 and wrote about it, wrote about so-called blacks, Native Americans, and Latinos. They were the historical, biblical Israelites. Although Israelites are scattered across the globe, the history of the Israelites in the Western Hemisphere is documented in early Black American history, to be continued.